Professor Huang.
Thank you, Paul. Let me give sort of three sets of comments. They are related to China, but the last comment is about, since the theme of the conference is about new economic thinking, and so let me leave with you the question whether or not the China experience requires a new thinking. I think there are a lot of technical discussions in China about exchange rate, capital account convertibility, the internationalization of RMB. I defer to Yongding on those issues, but there are other fundamental debates in China that are going on, which I like to share with this audience. And these debates, fundamental political and economic debates, sharpened considerably in the aftermath of the financial crisis in the West. There may be a causal relationship between the two, they may be not, but they seem to correlate with each other. These fundamental debates are about, it's not so much about the level of the market development, whether or not we should converge with American capitalism. It's about direction. Do you go more toward the market direction? Do you go more toward state-owned direction? And this is a real debate that has real policy consequences. Politically, does the country embrace political reforms at whatever pace that it chooses to? That's a very real debate that is going on in the country. And there, I'm not a fortune teller. I don't know which way things are going to go. Let me just say what I know, and then argue that there are reasons to worry about what is going to happen. On the economic side, the stimulus program has gone through mostly state-owned sector. And this morning you heard from Victor Shi, who has done excellent work documenting the level of the debt in the state sector, which is high, very high, and I won't repeat his remarks. On the political side, there are different voices coming from the central government, from local government. And let me say, for someone whose parents suffered deeply during the Cultural Revolution, there are local governments now who openly and directly talk about returning to Cultural Revolution, returning to the Maoist period, and using the slogans from that period to justify their programs and policies. For someone like me, and for people who grew up in that period, this is extremely alarming development. So the debate matters, right? So how you view the US financial crisis matters. Do you view this as a total destruction of some of the consensus principles that we had about political and economic development? Or do you view this as a sort of mostly a debate about the West, about how the role of the regulation should play in the Western economy in the United States? Should that debate have this huge spillover effect on countries such as China, and maybe India? I think Governor Reddy gave a very nuanced interpretation of where India should be going. But I think for a country like China, I would argue that the country needs more market development, needs more liberalization rather than less. The second comment has to do with at least providing one view of looking at China as a growth experience. There are different points of views about this, and I'm not insisting that this particular view is necessarily correct, but let me just lay out that view. And then the basic view is that if you look at the way the reforms unfolded, they were unfolding in a pro-market, more liberal direction, especially in the first half of the last 30 years, in the first 15 years of the reform, three reform decades from 78 to now. But most of the Western thinking about China is focused on the last period. And this is where this whole view has arisen, that China's growth is driven by mercantilism, accumulation of foreign exchange reserves, export subsidy, export promotion. That empirically is a very flawed view in terms of the whole reform period as a whole. It is a correct view of the last 10 years, but whenever you have a view that says that that's how Chinese growth has happened, you kind of have to reconcile that view with the previous 20 years when the country didn't have those characteristics. In the 1980s, the country grew very, very fast, and with an overvalued exchange rate. For a number of years, the country had current account deficits. For much of the 1990s, the country had small surpluses and even some deficits in the early part of the 1990s. The foreign exchange accumulation and the huge role of the external trade only really began to characterize the Chinese economy in the last 10 years. And I would argue it is in those last 10 years when you began to observe some very severe structural imbalances, social problems, rising income inequality, crony capitalism. So mercantilism, even though it is associated with very fast GDP growth, it is also associated with the accumulation of these structural imbalances. I would argue that the success of, the reason why I point this thing out is because implicit in the view that the Chinese growth miracle is a result of mercantilism, implicit in that view is that the government obviously played a very important role in manipulating exchange rate, subsidizing exports. I'm not denying that the government did all of that in the last 30 years, but the contribution of those policies to the growth only began to matter tremendously in the last 10 years, and that was, I would argue, in the last 10 to 15 years. If you look at other metrics, such as social performance indicators, income distribution, Victor Shi gave some really, really alarming estimates about wealth concentration. All of that happened in the second half of the last 30 years when China began to move in that mercantilistic direction. The way I interpret Chinese growth experience is that it has three very different phases. The first period is broad-based, welfare-enhancing rural growth benefiting 80% of the population in the 1990s and maybe roughly to the early 1990s. And then you have WTO, you have FDI, foreign direct investment and trade, and that characterized some part of the 1990s. And then you have this infrastructure growth in the last 10 years. And those three different periods have very different, even though if you look at the GDP performance, they don't differentiate among themselves very, very clearly. But if you look at other metrics and other indicators, they are extremely different from each other. If you look at household income growth, especially on the part of the rural population, the fastest household, this is take-home pay, the wage growth, take-home pay, the fastest growth period was in the first period. And then it went down substantially in the 1990s, despite the fact that the GDP growth was very high. It began to pick up a little bit in the last 5 or 6 years, and in the last 3 years, it probably has picked up even more, but not to the level of the performance recorded for the 1980s. So it is very important, I'm sorry to bother you with some history. As a business school professor, usually we don't talk about history, and but I have to talk about history a little bit more here. If you look at the 1980s, the country didn't have much infrastructure. The country didn't have a lot of trade. The country didn't have a lot of FDI. The things that accounted for the growth in that period was, surprisingly, substantial financial liberalization and private sector development, indigenous domestic private sector development. The reason why we don't attribute the Chinese success to those factors is very simple. It's sort of sociology about knowledge. All of that took place in the rural area, where it is much more difficult to observe these things. Data availability is extremely poor, and there is no standard data series to actually reconstruct that part of the economic history. My own work has delved into these documents and thousands of pages and documents, and this is the empirical basis on which I constructed that period of history. In the rural area in the 1980s, I'm actually surprised that it is not the Chinese who won the Nobel Prize for microfinance, because Chinese began to do a lot of microfinance in the 1980s. They deregulated the rural credit cooperatives. They allowed, and this is very important, they allowed the entry of private actors in financial intermediation. There was an organization that was completely private that covered almost 80% of the country in the 1980s. And what is very interesting is that that organization was never acknowledged by the central bank to be legal. But in the 1980s, if one part of the government was not acknowledging your existence, you would go to another part of the government and get the legal status. So that organization was protected by Ministry of Agriculture. And in our work, we look at the coverage of these purely private financial intermediation, and the coverage was substantial in rural part of China. Remember, in the 1980s, 80% of the country was agriculture. So when you cover, say, 50% of the 80%, that is a very substantial coverage. And that took place basically within 5 or 6 years. We have now household data sets that show that not only the coverage was very wide, the informal private sector credits enabled the rural farmers to go into non-agricultural activities. And this is why in China, what you observe in the 1980s is not this massive migration from agriculture to industry, but indigenous development of a rural industry. There are other things going on, but the financial intermediation was the key. What about the private sector development? Indigenous private sector development, that was also quite robust and substantial in the first half of the reforms. One other reason why I stress the first half rather than the second half is that for many developing countries, they're faced with how to jumpstart their growth, right? So to look at the Chinese growth experience in the initial years of economic growth is actually a very meaningful exercise because it has implications for other developing countries. I'm not saying other countries should copy China, but it deserves a illustration to other developing countries that this is how China engineered its growth. Private sector development, it was also substantial, mostly in the rural area. In 1994, Jeffrey Sachs and Win-Tae Wu wrote a very famous paper on why you observe the difference between China and former Soviet Union and Eastern European countries. I think they pinned down on exactly the right factor, which is the difference between China and Soviet Union and former Soviet Union is agriculture. China had a large agriculture. Soviet Union didn't. Their analysis is that because Soviet Union didn't have a large agricultural sector, you have to privatize the industry in order to release the labor into the new private sector development. Whereas in China, you have this surplus labor pool from the agriculture. I disagree a little bit with that reasoning, even though the fundamental insight is there. I would emphasize the role of entrepreneurship. If you talk to many entrepreneurs in China today, not in high tech, not in real estate, but in manufacturing, many of them came from a rural background. Rural China was actually extremely entrepreneurial, for reasons that were that should be very clear, because socialism never extended social protection to the rural population, so there were still risk-taking attitudes in the countryside. The political control of the country was much more substantial in the urban part of the country rather than in the rural part of the country. So there was some residual entrepreneurial activity already in the rural area. And with reforms, with with financial liberalization, that entrepreneurship began to develop very, very quickly. Let me just end, because I'm running out of time, let me just end on this idea of whether or not there needs to be a new thinking. I think first of all, I worry a little bit about intellectual crowding out. So many best minds in economic profession, in social science profession, are now increasingly thinking about crisis in the United States rather than development in emerging economies. My MIT colleague Simon Johnson is a good example of that. He used to work on Eastern European countries, and now he's attacking crony capitalism in the United States. And I keep telling Simon that there are a lot of other countries that have crony capitalism, and he should not forget those countries. So I kind of worry a little bit about that, and I also worry on behalf of China whether or not they are overlearning from the financial crisis in the United States and not make a sufficient distinction between those policies that are geared toward mitigating or reducing crisis and those that are designed for development, right? So, obviously there are overlaps, but they can also be different from each other. The third thing I want to say is that for US academics, especially for economists, I think one challenge is that the profession needs to have higher tolerance for different kinds of data. Right? I wouldn't have gotten the view that I have about China in the 1980s if I didn't go to the bank documents, if I didn't study local history and things like that. There's no standard data series about 1980s. Now I'm doing work on 1970s and 60s, and even before that, there's no standard data series. And you have to be a little bit tolerant of different forms of data. And this is something that is very, very difficult for economics profession. At business school, we have higher tolerance. In political science, in sociology, we have higher tolerance, but not so much in economics. Thank you very much.